please give a warm welcome to Casper ter Kuile from the On Being podcast.
Good morning, everyone. Hi. So my name's Casper ter Kuile. I have a great job title, I think. I'm the Director of Possibility at the On Being project. And my team there has spent the last kind of 4 years looking at how our structure of community and structure of spirituality has been changing. So my role is sat between Harvard Divinity School and On Being. And what I hope to do this morning is just to illustrate some of the kind of meta trends around belonging and spiritual becoming that we've been tracking. And I think perhaps offer a question or a challenge to us all to think about as we explore these incredible conversations today. So I'm from England originally. And I didn't grow up with any sort of religious background. And I was a climate activist in my young adult life. And was very passionate about the UN climate negotiations, which some of you may have followed. And at some point, especially during the Copenhagen talks in 2009, I got to the point where I felt like the scale of the problem that we were trying to solve was just so outmatched with the resources that I had as an activist. And I started to wonder, well, maybe it's not just about the solving problem in the outer world. There has to be some connection with this inner-outer life. And so very unexpectedly found myself in Divinity School. And as a person who was non-religious in a divinity school, I kind of walked around sometimes being like, what am I doing here? But what was so interesting to me was to find that this was a place where I could ask questions about culture, about ritual, about community, and started to notice these kind of enormous trends around social isolation. So you'll be familiar with most of this, but more and more of us live alone. We're scrolling in the dark on our phones. We are working longer hours. And all of this, of course, has huge impacts on our health. Most of you might remember the kind of meta-analysis a couple of years ago that loneliness is now a bigger killer than smoking 15 cigarettes a day or being obese. And the kind of the depth of this isolation is just astounding. 1 in 4 Americans say they have nobody to talk to about meaningful things in their life, and that includes their family or their spouse. So this sense, this kind of pervasive experience of disconnection is fully spread through our social fabric. Now, at the same time, as this kind of rise of isolation is growing, we use this language of spiritual poverty, the sense that the places where we can go and the people that we can talk to about our spiritual or our inner life is also decreasing. You'll perhaps be familiar with the statistics of religious affiliation. We're seeing this dramatic increase of the number of people like myself who had no or have no religious affiliation. And just this week, there was some new data that came out that said that these nuns, the people who tick none of the above when asked about their religious identity, is now a larger group both than Catholics and evangelicals in the US. So again, this kind of rise of the number of people who have no spiritual home is growing, especially when you look at the generations. So younger people are much more likely to fall into this category. Now, we had a picture of a lonely young guy, and here we have a picture of a lonely older lady. But all of that is just to illustrate that the kind of decline in religious affiliation, to me, seems connected to this rise of social isolation. The statistic that still kind of strikes me is that more than 3,500 churches close every year in America. So you're seeing that landscape, that fabric, decline. Now, why is this happening? There's lots of reasons, but the one which I hope to explore with you today, and I hope will inform how we think about our meaning-making lives, is this idea of unbundling and remixing. So, you know, a couple of decades ago, this picture will be familiar to some of you. We would read a newspaper. Now, who reads a print newspaper every day? A couple, but not so many as there used to be. Good for you, ma'am. keep it going. But the print media kind of world is in somewhat of a crisis because our behavior has changed so much around reading newspapers. A newspaper used to be a bundle of services, right? It gave you the latest news. It gave you the sports scores from last night. It gave you maybe personal ads or a crossword puzzle to enjoy, to kind of while away the time, perhaps on your commute to work. But today, there's all sorts of different apps and products that do each of those individual jobs perhaps better than the one that kind of bundled them all together. So I met my husband on OkCupid, for example, who listens to the daily podcast, right? The growth of podcasts has been enormous as a way to get our news, or at least that kind of in-depth analysis. Rotten Tomatoes to get your kind of movie reviews. Each of these services has unbundled the kind of value that a newspaper used to bundle together. Well, from what we've seen, a similar thing is happening with our religious or spiritual lives. So if you look at the Catholic Church, for example, a couple of hundred years ago, it was an institution that not only gave you your spiritual life, confession, mass, but it also was a strong community. It was often the place of your education, your healthcare. It kind of provided this like 360 service. And more today, perhaps you're using the Insight meditation timer or Headspace for your meditation. You might go on a hike with friends to experience something bigger than yourself. You might, go home to celebrate the high holidays or Christmas with your family to kind of connect to, tradition and family. And so rather than everything being bundled up in one institution, it's being unbundled in all of these different ways, which on the one hand is wonderful because you're making your own personal mix. And a lot of people grow up in kind of multi-faith households, perhaps marry someone from a different tradition, and so you're able to create something new, something unique for your family. And yet at the same time, it means that less and less in our meaning-making lives is shared. And so we don't have those kind of home bases, those places to return to with the whole community. This was a piece in The Atlantic, which I really enjoyed, which illustrates how that unbundling then leads to mixing. So this was a piece about how Black women especially are exploring kind of ancient indigenous Wiccan and witchcraft culture and reclaiming indigenous practices, but remixing them with Christian storytelling practices and rituals. And I love this last line that one of the interviewees shared, that the Bible ain't nothing but a big old spell book. So you're seeing, again, how those two pieces are being mixed together. And so creating that kind of unique little something. So at the On Being project, which, do we have any On Being listeners in the house? Yes, welcome. I'm so glad you're here. The team in Minneapolis sends you their regards. The On Being project hosts the podcast, of course, which has been downloaded more than 200 million times now. It's an incredible community of listeners who not only engage with the content kind of as a reflective tool and a place for moral imagination and social courage, but we're seeing more and more people kind of find their meaning-making life through engaging with the podcast. And so the growth of media as a place where we're doing some of this spiritual reflection is something we've absolutely seen, and then taking that out into the world through projects like the Civil Conversations Project and the new digital home that we have, which I hope you'll check out with a host of resources like the Better Conversations Guide, kind of takes that inner reflective life out into the world. And one of the things that we did last year was to convene a group of 500 On Being listeners and community members. And it was amazing to see how that kind of unbundling and remixing has happened within our community. The diverse set of religious identities, as much as everything else, kind of finding a home in this platform rather than within an institution. So as you're looking at this kind of landscape of change within community and within religion, my work has really been looking at new communities that seem to be finding an expression within these unbundled and remixed times. And I wanted just to share 3 stories from that landscape. The first is Afro flow yoga. Do we have any Afro flowers in the room? I highly recommend you try it. An amazing practice and community built by Leslie Salmon Jones and Jeff Jones, kind of integrates and remixes this practice of yoga, of course, but also of dance, and also of kind of an ancestral journey. So Leslie and Jeff have created this 2-hour physical experience, so it's an embodied practice, in which you, through physical movement and live music, make a journey across the Middle Passage. So following the route of people who were enslaved and captured and brought to the US. And it's a journey of integration and liberation. And what's so interesting to me is that for people who might have left religious institutions or left kind of traditional spiritual practices, are finding new homes to express and explore their inner life. So especially through embodied practices, you'll see a huge growth, for example, in boutique fitness organizations. CrossFit, SoulCycle are some of the groups we've looked at, where people are building real communities of meaning and belonging around a shared practice. So in the Afroflow yoga community, not only do you kind of like have this workout experience together, but it's this emotional journey that you go on together. And then afterwards, there's time for a circle to share, what came up for you, what did you experience, what did you learn from one another in that embodied experience. So although we're seeing a decline in religious affiliation, we're seeing an increase in organizations like this, where people find a sense of meaning and a sense of connection to something bigger than themselves. Another trend that we've been looking at is the growth of makerspaces. Do we have any people who go to makerspaces? Yes, amazing. So makerspaces, on kind of a value level, very simply, are places where you get to make things in your life, right? You might be a jewelry designer, or you might be working on a woodwork project, or you might be a graphic illustrator, all sorts of things, and you get access to tools that you might need for your creative work. But what happens underneath that is that we're seeing that these communities, again, become kind of central meaning-making spaces for people who use them. So at this community, this is from the Artisans Asylum in Somerville in Massachusetts, near where I live. And the Artisans Asylum, brought people together, gave them access to tools and a space to work. But slowly, people started to get to know each other. They started to fall in love with each other. Thanksgiving came around, and someone said, well, why don't we host a Maker's Giving? And so this community now starts to celebrate the holidays together. Because it's open 24 hours a day, they were noticing that people were coming 2, 3 a.m. to work in the space. And they were curious about what that was about. And they heard more and more stories of members saying, I really struggle, it might be with the risk of self-harm, might be an experience of anxiety, and coming to work on my project, coming to work on my arts and creative life gives me a sense of calm and a sense of purpose and a sense of home. And so this place really uses that Artisans Asylum name with kind of tongue-in-cheek, because they're seeing it as a place not just of creative formation, but also of mental well-being. And it's now become one of the leading advocates for social housing in the city of Somerville, because they're realizing that a lot of people are using the space if they're housing insecure, for example. So it's been, again, what you would expect to happen in a congregation, right? People who gather for one thing also end up working on social justice issues, serving their neighbors in the community. We're seeing that happen in places like makerspaces as well. And then finally, perhaps one of my favorite communities to learn from is an organization in the DC area called the Sanctuaries. And the Sanctuaries calls itself a diverse arts community with soul. And what they do is they bring people together, again, using the creative arts as the kind of hosting principle, to collaborate across religious, racial, all sorts of lines of difference. And they use that art to serve social justice missions. So, for example, to prevent gentrification in Southeast. And the Sanctuaries does this really interesting thing that I think a lot of communities sometimes struggle with, because a lot of these new communities that we've studied start with one person who has a need, goes looking somewhere to find a solution to that need, doesn't find it, and starts something themselves and kind of brings their friends together around it. But what often happens then is you get a very monocultural community, all right? Because people are mostly connected to people like themselves. The Sanctuaries has very intentionally looked to build relationships across difference from the center. And so it's never had a physical home in its first years, because DC, as so many of our cities, are so stratified by which area you live in. What they do is they provide communities or people who have a lot of community but perhaps not a lot of opportunity with chances to share their art, to share their creative work, and people who are coming often new to the city who have lots of opportunity but not a lot of community, a chance to build relationships of meaning. So I highly recommend you check out the sanctuaries. They host things like soul slams, where people come and give like mini sermons as well as collaborate in all sorts of incredible musical collaborations. So the question I want to leave you with, thank you, is if we're unbundling and remixing our community and our meaning-making life, right? If we're personalizing more and more and making something that fits our unique expression of who we are, and therefore we're fragmenting the social ties, what are the ways in which we can rebundle? What are the ways in which we can bring people together again, perhaps not around a shared identity or a shared belief, but perhaps around a shared practice? And so for the last few years, we've been gathering community leaders who are doing this kind of thing. And some of them are secular, right? They might lead fitness classes, or they might host a creative makerspace. And some of them are religious. They might lead a Jewish summer camp, or they might lead a Muslim small groups, for example. And what we found is that even across that ostensible divide between what is secular and what is sacred, there's actually an enormous amount of shared work, even when we're using different language. So as we're kind of hearing all these incredible stories throughout the day today, and I hope you perhaps recognize some of this in your own life, my question to you is how can we rebundle? How can we find new principles that hold us together, even when we're all on our own individual journey? So with that, I say thank you so much. I hope today is stimulating. I hope it's creatively provocative. And I hope that you'll leave with at least 2 or 3 people to continue a conversation with. I will be here for the day, so I see my time is up. But I'm so grateful for your kind attention and wish you all well. Thank you so much.